acres of Tobangar, the Tongva world, including the Los Angeles Basin, South Channel Islands, San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, and portions of Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. CalStat LA is located within these lands, and as an institution located on unceded Tongva land, we pay our respects to our ancestors, our elders, and our relatives' relations, past, present, and emerging. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold CalStat LA more accountable to the needs of American Indian peoples. Thank you. I would like to introduce our panelists right now. Let me read their biographies for you guys real fast. I'd like to introduce Dr. Gordon Chang, who is a Senior Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities at Stanford University. Dr. Chang writes about different areas of history, including the historical connections between race and ethnicity in America. He has published extensively in the areas of US diplomacy, America-China relations, the Chinese diaspora, Asian American history, and global history. His two most recent books have examined the history of Chinese railroad workers in America in the 19th century. He has published recently Friends and Enemies, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, 1948 to 1972, which was a winner of the 1991 Stuart L. Bernath Prize for Historians of Foreign Relations. His second most recent book was published as Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, published in 2019 and winner of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Award for Literature. Our next panelist is Dr. Weiling Deng, who is an adjunct professor of interdisciplinary studies in the core division at Champlain College in Vermont. She holds a PhD in comparative and international education from UCLA, and her dissertation critically explored the contemporary Chinese feminist activism as a transnational manifestation of new social and class divisions in post-socialist China and the post-colonial global North. Her research and teaching interests more broadly include gender and sexuality in modern China, transnational social movement, global education, and citizenship and labor in the post-Cold War age. Our last panelist is Susan Park, the Executive Director of Asian Americans for Housing and Environmental Justice. Susan is a food historian, a writer, a second-generation Korean American, and she sometimes describes herself as a 1992 LA Korean. Susan is also the publisher of Gidra 2.0, which is a radical progressive magazine for Asian Americans. So welcome to our event. We hope you will be inspired. We hope you will enjoy this program that we have for you. I would like to introduce my colleague, Peter Chesney, who is a UCLA PhD candidate, ABD, almost done, and he will be our moderator this evening as we get into topics that are so very important to today's landscape. So Peter, welcome, thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for coming today. As of right now, I see that people are still filtering in a little bit, which is perfectly all right. But I would like to invite Dr. Chang to begin his talk first, which is going to take approximately 20 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A session, and then we'll have some remembrances. So I want you to be aware as we move into the lineup of speakers that they're going to be working in three different kind of formats or communicating in three different styles. So Dr. Chang, take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation and to speak to something which is very important for us all, and that is what I think I was been asked to speak about is the contemporary moment, the current moment we have with this upsurge in anti-Asian violence. And as a historian, I'm going to place this in some historical perspective. And I have some slides, and I do enjoy conversation and question and answer, so I'm going to make my comments concise. And we have two other great speakers, and we'll be able to hopefully get into our question and answer period, and so we're going to have exchange. But I think we all know that we've seen a terrible upsurge, proliferation of incidents related to incidents that are anti-Asian, are examples of anti-Asian hate that have spread around the country. And what I like to do is to give some sense of the history of this moment. And let me see if I can share my screen. All right, is that visible?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So here we go. All right. I think if we watch the news, we see these ugly incidents that have occurred with terrible regularity these past months. Anti-Asian events began almost at the same time that the COVID crisis began. And in part, as I'll mention later on, I attribute this to the incendiary, and if you, I'm going to make this more political, incendiary and demagogic comments by former President Trump, who scapegoated China and Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in particular, as carriers of disease and responsible for infecting America. And people took a note of what he had to say. They took it, as I say, they saw it as a sanction of violence to scapegoat Asians. And we see these terrible incidents, which I've selected not so much of, well, with some specificity. All of them are of elderly people and are women. And this has been a characteristic of a lot of the violence that we've seen. And so we can ask ourselves, or we should ask ourselves, why has this been the case? Now, also, and this is a positive observation I have, is that the incidents have not gone unchallenged, that people have come out to protest, to demonstrate, such as we see in the lower right-hand corner. And also there's been a tremendous outpouring of commentaries by Asian Americans and others to condemn the hatred, perhaps an unprecedented amount of commentary, certainly that I can remember. I mean, I was talking to Susan earlier about the birth of the Asian American movement. And so I've been around for a while. But I might say that this outpouring of commentary and outrage and anger and sorrow about these incidents really is quite striking. But I will also have to say that it surprises me a bit, because many of these comments seem to be sort of shocked. They were expressing shock that this can happen in our country. This is happening to Asian Americans. There was sort of a sense of where did this all come from? And it's kind of a sense of not knowing that the United States has a long history of anti-Asian violence. And this is just the current manifestation. Many people, including here at Stanford, I've talked to who didn't know much about Asian American studies, so they've been shocked to see these incidents. Now, so I'm going to go back and do a little quick history here. If any of you know what this scene is, you could maybe shout. Well, I was going to ask this rhetorically. Do you know where this is? Well, this is Los Angeles. This is quite near where, if you were watching the Academy Awards the other night near Union Station, this is just a couple of blocks, I believe, from where Union Station stands today. This was the center of old Los Angeles back in the 1870s. And a Chinese section of the town was just around the corner. And this was a terrible site of one of the ugliest massacres of Chinese in the 19th century. Chinese were routinely murdered, hunted down, and killed in the gold country and in the mountain country of California. Hundreds were killed, hundreds were murdered, and with no prosecutions. It was sort of open season on Chinese, who were reviled as a racial other and also seen as targets for those who wanted to rob, to steal, but also to persecute. And in 1871, 18 Chinese were a mob of 500 people rounded up and killed 18 Chinese and wounded many more, hanged Chinese from lampposts, mutilated them, burned their bodies. It was horrific violence. A few years later in Rock Springs, Wyoming, at least 28 Chinese were driven out of town and shot. This was a depiction of the event some years later by white workers. The Chinese, many of them had been railroad workers and were now miners in Rock Springs mines, and were shot and killed and their bodies burned in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. And then in 2 years later, up in Oregon, this was the site of perhaps the worst massacre of Chinese, where at least 34 Chinese miners were slaughtered by evil villains who surprised them, shot them down as they tried to flee, and again mutilated their bodies. This is one of the features of racial hatred that we've seen, unfortunately, in the country, directed against many different other communities. Is the mutilation of bodies is not just killing people, bad enough as it is, but there's a hatred that is released and is expressed in the physical mutilation of bodies, including sexual mutilation. Now, this is just some context, the kind of ideological or cultural context of the times. You can see here on the left a cartoon that appeared in the journal, not coincidentally, called The Wasp. But although it didn't stand for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it is meant to be sort of a journal of commentary and sharp criticism. But this was a graphic commentary on the anti-Chinese sentiment, expressing the anti-Chinese sentiment, a statue for our harbor as opposed to the Statue of Liberty in New York. This is for San Francisco Harbor. And you can see this ghoulish figure here, semi-human, with a foot on a skull, death. There are rats all around the base and vermin, and radiating from its head is filth, immorality, disease, ruin to white labor. So this captures sort of the sentiment that was directed against Chinese as what they saw as the source of all sorts of evils for white society. But you notice the issue of disease comes up, and this goes back into the issue of COVID, when and Asians being characterized as susceptible, particularly susceptible to certain types of disease and bearers of disease that would infect other lands. This other graphic on the right is from Canada, because not just of the United States, but North America. Again, you can see cheap labor, ruining white working families, immorality, encouraging prostitution, gambling, but also smallpox, typhoid, as you can see, again, the issue of disease quite prominently displayed. Chinese, as to be said, were seen as less than human, and therefore deserving or eligible for massacre, for murder. And you see this kind of reverse evolution of the species, and it's this cartoon here of where the Chinese develops and is really, in fact, some type of animal. And then on this cartoon advertisement on the right, which is for a product that would kill rats and mice and bed bugs, some type of poison, it does a better job than Chinese who eat rats. Again, thinking back this thing of bats and eating rats, and this disgusting sort of image. Now, these incidents in the 19th century were directed against Chinese specifically. That was the main or predominant Asian group in the country until the late 19th century, when Japanese and Koreans and Filipinos started to arrive in the country. And the anti-Chinese animus was expanded to include hatred, racist sentiment towards those groups as well. And we see a beginning of what we call a racialization, that even though these are distinct nationalities or ethnicities, that over time in white society's eyes, or at least some in white society, that they become part of a race, as different as Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, South Asians, Chinese are, that they become a racial other, not just an ethnic other. So you can see this fascinating pamphlet over here, which I would recommend some of you are teachers or researchers. This is online. This is an incredible pamphlet. I use it in my own classes. Some reasons for Chinese exclusion: meat versus rice, American manhood against Asiatic coolieism. which shall survive, which was written by Samuel Gompers, the famous labor leader, who was promoted in many of our schools, and his name is on the name of many of public schools. But Gompers was a virulently anti-Asian and a racist, and he published this pamphlet around 1906 or so, when the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first version of it, which was passed in 1882, and it came up for periodic renewal, and it was up for renewal again, and he published this to appeal to American polity to support extension of Chinese exclusion. But the title itself, I mean, we could spend a whole hour just disentangling, just thinking about this title. I mean, it's so evocative of different things. The metaphors that are in it, meat versus rice, you have sort of this, again, a metaphor for strength and for whiteness, versus rice, which is seen as sort of weak and non-nourishing. American manhood against Asiatic coolieisms, or you have the gender issue in their Asiatic coolieism, Asiatic, not just Chinese, but Asiatic coolieism, sort of a semi-slave condition, not of a physical condition. And you would think that this is a expose of weakness versus strength, of superiority versus inferiority. But then you come to this curious phrase, which one is going to survive? It's not clear that the superior race, the stronger race, the meat-eating race is going to survive over that which is so degraded and corrupt and weak. But this is really, and you read the whole pamphlet, it really presents, which was pretty common at the time, this sense of a social Darwinism, a competition of races for supremacy and for survival, and which one was going to survive. James D. Phelan, some of you may know of me, he was a famous politician in California. I was a mayor of San Francisco at the earthquake, and then ran for senator. And this was his re-election slogan when he ran for re-election a few years later: keep California white. And what he means that he wants California to be white by keeping out, and in his view, the main danger, which was Asians. Japanese at that time was on his mind, but other Asian nationalities. So Asians become a target of hatred beyond Chinese. And you have these, I mean, I sometimes hesitate to show these because they're so ugly that, but they are part of history, and they are reminders. And as I said, many people don't know this history. And so often when I'm speaking these days, people are aghast to say, this actually happened. We know, what is all this about? You can hear about Filipinos here. And then, but I think something which people do know is what happened what happened after Pearl Harbor and the scapegoating of Japanese Americans as looking like the enemy. This was a famous photograph by Dorothea Lange, the great photographer in the 30s and 40s. And she took this in downtown Oakland of the front of a Japanese-owned store, and he put up this sign here, which has become iconic now. This sign, and it now has been used in artwork, I am an American, because he knew what the feeling was going to be against him and other Japanese Americans, and he wanted to be loud and clear of who he was and what he stood for. But as we know, Japanese Americans were targeted in the months after Pearl Harbor. There were scores of murders, assaults, people who looked Japanese, including Filipinos, Chinese, were murdered or and assaulted and shot and wounded in those months. And I'm doing a longer study about that terrible time period. And this, of course, results in the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese into federally run prison camps. This is an act of mass state violence. All the other things that I showed you before were other forms of violence or threatened violence, implied violence, promotion of violence. And this was an expression of the actual federal policy that forced the people into these what were called internment camps. And of course, Los Angeles saw one of the largest exodus, removal of people into Manzanar up in the desert country below Yosemite. Now, there are many other incidents. I'm just choosing some to highlight because of their drama and also the message or the meaning that we can glean from them. And some of you know of this terrible, tragic story. It is a story of one person, a young man named Vincent Chin, who went out to celebrate his impending wedding with his fiancée, as shown here in the photo. Vincent Chin was third generation Chinese American, and he got into an altercation. This was up in Detroit. Two unemployed white men auto workers, who accused him of being Japanese and thus therefore responsible for their loss of jobs, because U.S. auto companies were competing well with Honda and Toyota at the time. And so these two guys got a baseball bat out of the back car and hunted him down and bashed his head in and killed him. Now, why this was an important moment for Asian Americans was that it was a terrible tragedy, but also because it highlighted the racialization. He was killed because he was called to be Japanese. This is all witnesses that pointed this out. And it had nothing. Vincent Chin, who I think had graduated from community college. He was a drafts person. He was going to, but he died. And this was, and then also what was quite striking, his mother spoke out, came before people to speak about her tragedy, her loss, her grief, and the injustice, because the perpetrators were given very, very light sentences. They didn't serve time in jail. And she went around the country calling for justice for Vincent Chin. You can see the Reverend Jesse Jackson in the background there. And I'm not sure that's Mike Morase over to his right with the sunglasses. But these are other Asian American activists from this time in 1982. So that again, it sort of highlights the racialization of people. Now, there's another connection that we can make, and that is the connection with overseas events, in particular the wars, the many wars that have been that have occurred in Asia. Starting in the 20th century, we're going even back to the late 19th century, there was a war in Korea, when Americans tried to open up Korea, and they went to war against Korea. But also in the that more people know about is the Philippines-American War, when the United States suppressed the Philippine independence movement after the winning of independence from Spain, the Filipino independence from Spain. The Philippines had been a Spanish colony since the 17th century. And the United States turned around and took over the Philippines, but had to suppress a massive resistance movement and independence movement. We also know about World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb in Asia, the occupation of Japan, hundreds of thousands of American troops occupying Japan. Then there was the Korean War with massive loss of life, millions of people who died, Americans involved and still occupying parts of Korea. And then the Vietnam War. Now here, so war in Asia and connected to racial violence in America, I think it's quite clear that many Americans go overseas, they see the enemy as being Asian, and because it's a racialized enemy, they return home and they see Asians here, and racially a continuation of the people against whom they fought. And so this is a horrific incident here in 1989, which people have forgotten. One of the early mass killings at a schoolyard. This was just up in Stockton, up the road, where a gunman dressed himself in military fatigues and brought semi-automatic weapons and sat at the fence around the schoolyard and killed 5 Southeast Asian kids and wounded 30-something other people, mainly Southeast Asians. You see these really heartbreaking photos of these kids who were gunned down by this guy in the Cleveland elementary schools. You can see here, these 4 kids who were shot by this guy. Now I'm going to come to an end here, bring it up to the other ethnicities. We have this in Wisconsin, where a gunman went in, white supremacists went into a Sikh temple and murdered 7 worshipers. These were some of those who were killed. And as you know, just last week, the Federal Express mass killing, there were 4 Sikhs who were also there. And so the Sikhs and other Asians are a visible group, and they tend to be singled out for murder. Now, I'll go through these quickly. You can read these. I think the point is pretty clear, which is that, as I see it, Trump, even before he became president, liked to find people to attack, to scapegoat, to blame problems on, whether it be inner city people, whether it be immigrants, whether it be refugees, southern border people, that they were always somebody to attack and blame for the ills of America, and riled up sentiments against different groups. And then one of these targets was China. And so even very early on, as he was contemplating running, he would say these ridiculous things, that like such as this: the concept of global warming was created by the Chinese to make the U.S. manufacturing non-competitive, even thinking back to Vincent Chin and the auto industry competition. And he would say clearly incendiary things, as he did on the campaign trail. We can't continue to allow China to rape our country. I mean, it's calling somebody's raping the country. And it's the greatest theft in the history of the world. Now we come into COVID for people, and we call it the Kung flu, we call it the Chinese virus, all this stuff. Again, blaming China for the pandemic, and he spent more time trying to lay blame on other people than doing anything about it himself. Editorial comment just there, and things such as this. I mean, these you can't even say exaggerations. There's this bombast, which people took, the audiences that followed him took seriously. That this was war. This was Pearl Harbor. This was not just conflict. This was, he placed the issue of the COVID and conflict with China in the context of conflict, of militarized conflict. So shouldn't be a surprise that there are some people who just took this and ran with it, and now believe Asians are the source of the problems that we have. And in Atlanta, as we know, tragically, a couple of weeks ago, 6 Asian American women were killed of different ethnicities: Korean background, Chinese background, and again, an example of this hatred based upon race. And interestingly, for Asians, directed often against children and women and the elderly, those who are most vulnerable, is an interesting pattern that we have. Whereas we have the proliferation of police violence directed mainly against African-American young men, but that's another kind of pattern. And we can think about why we have these different patterns. So I'm going to stop here. This is, Dawn mentioned my book. This is the cover of the book. It is a history book, not a book of fiction, where I've tried to recover the lived experience of the railroad workers from China who built the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I hope you will be interested and go out and buy it. I have to put in a little pitch for myself there. But thank you for listening, and I'm eager to have a good conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Peter.
Yes, thank you so much. And this is just, it's a really, I think, a very difficult, history to hear for a lot of people who are in the Zoom right now. And I just want to kind of acknowledge that for a moment, because sometimes I think in events like this, we can move really quickly. And for those of us who are scholars and who are in the archives and who are reading these documents with our own eyes and holding them in our own hands, we can sometimes forget what it's like to see something like this for the first time, because it's been so long for us. So anyway, I'm giving us a moment to decompress, to think about where in your body these sights and these words and these stories, these narratives land. And then I'll say that I think that it's important for us when we're talking about anti-Asian hate to understand that it has this very long history, that the institutions that we're a part of have been complicit at times in that history. And I would say that the Historical Society, being a very old organization that's been part of the white settler claim making to Southern California, that the Historical Society acknowledges that it has not always been on the right side in these debates. So I hope that this comes across, that this presentation, that it's clear that what we're doing here is that we're trying to make that right. Okay, turning to Dr. Deng, I wanted to begin with a question, and we've already discussed these questions, but we're going to be doing a Q&A format. And the first question has to do with the purposes of higher education. What are the ways in which the education of international students, right? And by international students, I mean students from all over the world, but especially international students from Asia. What are the ways in which United States international education prepares Asian students for the depth of xenophobia, anti-Asian hatred and bigotry, and the ways in which it's intertwined with other forms of bigotry? What are the ways in which higher education prepares them? And I'd like you to comment on basically what's been done right and what could be done better. All right, thank you.
That's a great question. I come from a background of international comparative education. I spent many years, 8 years at UCLA and also Los Angeles. I do think it took me, to speak first from my personal experience, it took me a long time to identify with Asian American history. I arrived in LA in 2012, and now it's 2021. So it took me the entire length of these 9 years to really come to realize that we got to know something about Asian American history, and especially the start of this history, which was based in working class. So that taps into the victims of the Atlanta mass shooting. Most of them were working class, if not all. So my experience or my impression is that higher education or international education here in this country didn't really prepare us to think about the depth of this historical hate directed to Asian students, AAPI communities. One thing I'd like to mention is that there was a gap between Asian international students, the newer immigrants, and Asian Americans. And this gap is a temporal one. So for example, Chinatown, the old Chinatown, just next to downtown LA, it visually represents a more colonized China, and versus the new one in East LA, in San Gabriel Valley. It represents a newer, more powerful China. So here's a temporal gap that is very, very hard for students to bridge without institutionally organized seminars or knowledge to be disseminated, to be passed on to these students. So international students is something that's now unfortunately it's fundamentally ahistorical. So it doesn't really do this job to bridge the gap between Asias in different temporalities. So what universities actually do is to ask the students to, okay, we got to look forward, look upward, and even look inward to ourselves, to our own individual effort to become a better skilled worker in the knowledge-driven economy. But this gap between Asian Americans and newer Asian immigrants, international students, really needs to be addressed more. So my own experience of participating in BLM last year, because of the murder of George Floyd, actually was the moment through which I felt I started to identify with Asian American identity more, because it was through those mass protests that I became more aligned with the structural protest, the structural outcry against oppression, which is under the overarching governance of capitalism. So it was this ethnic cross-racial alliance that pulled me into this deeper knowledge of how America became what it is today. Yeah.
Oh, that's very well said. Thank you. And I'll just make a plug quickly. In the state of California, we have just passed an ethnic studies bill that's going to change the educational landscape of our public institutions. And I would really encourage anybody who's in an advisory capacity, anybody who's thinking about higher education, anybody who's thinking about a PhD and what they might want to teach, to be aware that this ethnic studies bill, I think, is a great answer to Dr. Deng's call for a way of familiarizing and bridging these temporal gaps. I think that's a really well said. Okay, as a next question, I know, Dr. Deng, that your research is really driven by an interest in gender and transnational feminism. So my next question for you has to do with the role of gender in anti-Asian hate and the fight against anti-Asian hate. What are the ways in which the hate is expressed in gendered terms, and what are the ways in which the resistance is mounted in gendered terms?
Thank you. That's really, really touching on what I've been thinking about lately. I want to mention something that's in the 19th century first, which I just learned about in preparation for this webinar. So there was a anti-Chinese women law. It's called Page Act, which was passed in 1875. And that's 70 years before the 1882 Chinese exclusion law. So that says something. The time difference here, 7 years, says something about gender as it's intertwined with race and also class. So at that time, the Chinese immigrants in San Francisco and California and the rest of the country, they were working class, but Chinese women at that time were considered like they represented, or they were considered embodying diseases that Dr. Chang just talked about. So women, with their capacity of bearing children, of playing a major role in reproduction, they were considered like an even greater threat to white life and to the kind of like a healthy religion and also morality of white life in America. So it was the Chinese women who got kicked out of the country first, who got banned from entering America first. So when the news of the Atlanta shooting broke out, and we learned that 6 out of 8 of the 8 victims were Asian women, it means something. It says that the hatred directed against Asian women still exists, and it's really hard to address class, gender, and race together without knowing that there's a historical specificity of exclusion of Asian women in this land. So in a lot of scholarly address or other events, gender and race were the forefront issues that are being highlighted, and as well as class. But it really takes a lot of reflective energy, reflective effort to know that in the meantime that we address the gender issue in this anti-Asian hate crime, the ways in which is like institutionalized scholars and academics address this problem is somewhat contradictory to the kind of neoliberal subject that international education tries to construct. So how do we counterbalance that impulse to becoming more elitist, to becoming more professional in terms of like scholarly languages, like frameworks, while also considering that those lives that were lost are working class women. So that this is very hard. So I think it's, and especially for in this event of a public history, I want to bring this out and share with the rest of the panel and also the audience.
Well, I think that's really well said, because on the one hand, you know, in your first answer, you talk about the need for bridges and coalition building, as Dr. Dennis pointed out in the comments. But then it's interesting that in the midst of creating those bridges, that if we create those bridges in such a way that we disappear differences, if we disappear the differences that are along the alignments of gender and class, for instance, that the kinds of bridges that are built are going to be pretty flimsy. So I think that's a really useful reminder. Thank you so much. My third question has to do with your current setting. You mentioned at the beginning that you're in Vermont, which is a famously socially democratic state. You're in the former hometown of Senator Bernie Sanders. And you're also at Champlain College, which is a famously white institution. And so I would also ask for your advice, basically what is to be done as instructors, as students who aren't all or aren't always in institutions that have diversity, right? Like if you're in a white institution, or if you're in an institution that does not have much Asian American or AAPI representation, what is to be done? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Actually, I have to acknowledge, I'm really happy to acknowledge that I have a few colleagues here from Champlain College, and that they're willing to show their support to this event, and not only to me, but to the importance, to the necessity of addressing AAPI issues, because AAPI issue is not, well, it's the problem of America is that it kind of frames AAPI issues as specifically related to this particular group of people, and not really addressing it, framing it as an American problem. So I think it is a challenge to teach in a predominantly white college, but I would say that this challenge is widely shared by people who look like me, faculty members who look like me, who got to teach class about China or Asia, like in Wisconsin, in Indiana, but even with a larger Asian population, like in Washington, in California, the same issues still exist. So it's not a really unique for Vermont or for my college. But the challenge here about teaching China, teaching about Asia, is that the students are heavily influenced by the kind of structure of education and mediascape and other mechanism of information dissemination that construct Asia, and especially China, as something exotic, as something so evil. And this is a very particular Cold War ideology that the students don't really have particular knowledge of what the conflicts or the forces that drove the Cold War, but they are nevertheless deeply embedded in this Cold War ideological after effects. So the challenge is how do we push forward this binary thinking between free and unfree state, democratic and a liberal and authoritarian state, or democratic, undemocratic societies. So we really should try to, well, it's something I'm still experimenting, exploring. It's not a set answer, but what I think is when we try to address AAPI issue, or when we try to teach or open up a floor for discussion about identity in general, or diversity in general, it's not only what's happening within the American mainland, but we got to think about America as an empire, because by its map that's by the map of America, we see that there are a lot of territories being claimed in the Asia Pacific. So with a book actually I'm reading now, How to Hide an Empire. It's a really important book for us to broaden this discussion of identity and diversity, to think in a relational perspective, that the harm that has been done to the AAPI communities within America is related to the ways in which the world has been made under the huge power of colonialism and capitalism.
Oh, that's so well said, and I'm delighted to see you recommend Emmer War's book, which is just absolutely fantastic, and I think does really incredible work of showing the relational framework that you mentioned, right? That Asian American identity is not just created in relationship to basically xenophobic hatred and nativism in the 19th century, and in relation to the loosening of immigration restrictions in the 20th century, but is also created in relationship to other peoples of color, to Pacific crossings, to all sorts of oceans and continents, and the intimacies that connect them all in the 19th century world and in the contemporary world. So it's with that in mind that we'll switch over to Susan Park, who I think can speak through personal reminiscences by being a kind of voice of Los Angeles in 1992 and the years before and after. And she will basically introduce us to memory as a kind of third framework for the sake of this presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Deng. Welcome, Susan Park.
Thank you, Peter. So I started kindergarten in Los Angeles in 1975. I was part of the first generation of American public school children to attend rapidly desegregating schools that were not just Black and white, but they were multi-ethnic and multilingual. And this was just 11 years after the Civil Rights Act had passed. All that racism did not go away in 11 years, you know. You know, LA does adapt pretty quickly, I think, to changes, but every year I can see that my teachers were adapting a little bit more and more to teaching, you know, multi-ethnic students. But that took a little bit of time. I mean, it was a pretty rocky road getting there. My brothers and I, my parents followed a diverse assimilationist model. My parents were against white supremacy, children of the Korean War. They were born at the tail end of Japanese occupation. They're against any kind of supremacy. But my parents didn't really know what diversity meant in America. So my brothers and I got to be, until about 1980, we got to be the first Asian children that a non-Asian child ever met. Sometimes the walk to and from school was very, very long. We didn't know what kind of kid from whatever background, could be Black, white, brown, indigenous, would try to start a fight with us, jump with us. It was America and LA was just a much more violent country at the social level. People spoke in more inflammatory terms. And then I was attending a highly gifted magnet school in the San Fernando Valley in Tarzana. I was bused in from Northridge, where I lived, in a white neighborhood, predominantly white neighborhood, to another predominantly white and Jewish neighborhood to attend classes in a silo of highly gifted kids. We had separate administrators, separate teachers. And then there were also the regular school kids who were mostly Jewish and white, who resented the highly gifted magnet kids. They also resented the PWT students who came in from the city, what was called the inner city back then. And that was largely Black and brown kids from South Central and some from East LA. I took the route because I was always like, I was so used to being the only Asian kid. I was always like kind of diplomatic about my friendships. I would be friends with somebody from any group, any kid that wanted to be friends with me and wanted to break from their group. I thought that's a cool kid. That's an interesting kid who wants to like learn about something new. It was 1982. I was in junior high school. I was very aware of Vincent Chin's murder because people thought he was Japanese. And I remember, the anti-Japanese sentiment. Japanese Americans have faced several waves of anti-Japanese sentiment. And it was because the rise of the Japanese economy, the apparent success of Japanese Americans who were held up as the poster children for the model minority myth. And I started becoming affected by that anti-Japanese sentiment. I'm Korean, we're neighbors. And before that, in second grade, so that was like 1977, I was affected by anti-Vietnamese refugee sentiment. So, and because, they're poor, dirty people, they're going to take resources, the boat people, and then kids at school start calling me a boat person. So then by Vincent Chin's murder, 1982, I was aware that, there are other Asians, and whatever other Asian trope is out there, anti-Asian trope is out there, it's going to be forced on me, So I was in seventh grade, I think. And one of a Black girl who was bused in started just following me. And it was during lunchtime, and then our fifth period class was going to start. And then all of a sudden, she just pushed me really hard into these, she tried to push me into these metal bars. But I had taken Taekwondo for a few years, so I was able to not get my face smashed in, but I got so angry and I turned around and I beat her up. Because she tried to push me and really tried to do serious damage by trying to push my face into metal bars. And then a regular school teacher, administrator, who's not supposed to handle discipline for magnet school students, just got a hold of me and he forced me into his office. He was a white man. And he told me that, his older brother had fought in the Korean War. He thought Korean girls were free. He had fought in the Vietnam War. He thought Vietnamese girls were free. And I'm just thinking, okay, Korea, Vietnam, anti-Japanese sentiment, Vincent Chin is dead. This Black girl just tried to beat me up. And then she said it was because she didn't like that, I was treated better than her when we were both non-white. I was like trying to make sense of all this. But that was a year that my Korean American political identity and my Asian American political identity was born. So I think I'm saying a lot of things that kind of support and amplify what Professor Chang and Professor Deng have spoken about. So my parents tried to follow this assimilationist model, but they also always spoke to me and my brothers in Korean at home. So I speak Korean, and that helps me be a bridge. And that's what my nonprofit is specifically about. And then let's see, I was taking notes as Professor Gordon and Professor Chang and Professor Deng were speaking. And so leading up to, so I described myself as a 1992 Korean American. I just want everybody to think about this question. Do you think the uprising in South Central LA would have happened without Korean Americans? Because the trigger really was the Rodney King verdict. We can add a lot of other things to it, including Korean Americans, but the trigger, right, for the uprising, for the unrest, which was not organized as a protest, was Rodney King's verdict. It wasn't Sun Jae-doo's verdict. It was Rodney King's verdict. And Black Americans also have a 400+ year history of protesting white supremacy and violence by the state and police brutality without any Korean involvement. So I want people to think about the Korean narrative, the Korean tropes as kind of like, seasoning and spice for the stories. And what Korean Americans did in terms of extractive capital, that is, some of that's true. But some of that is also the same racist trope about Asian Americans taking things, raping America, right? So multiple things can be true at the same time. There can be a small truth that gets exaggerated into a single story that becomes the primary story and looks like the primary reason. So in 1992, Korean Americans, I really felt like leading up to 1992, and also the Family Red Apple protest that was led by a self-described Black nationalist, Sonny Carson, okay, really targeted Korean Americans. And it wasn't just because we owned businesses in Black neighborhoods. It was also because, once again, you had another East Asian group who was successful, like the Japanese Americans. So the South Korean economy was rising. I heard constant comments and questions about why are Koreans so successful? Why is South Korea so successful? And I think some of the anti-Chinese sentiment, because I'm aware of it, I'm going to be aware of it. I have to be aware of it. It started really percolating when I had a restaurant near USC, and I had a lot of Chinese international students as customers and Chinese American students as customers. So it was kind of like this bridge space. And that's where Weiling Deng found me at my restaurant, because I was in like Chinese forums too and things like that. So it's kind of interesting. There's the xenophobia, the virus, Kung flu, all that stuff. But there's also Chinese Americans being punished once again, another group of East Asians being punished for the economic rise of China, the economic success of Chinese Americans. And I'm not leaving out South Asians, okay? I know about anti-Muslim hate and things like that, but specifically speaking about, the anti-Chinese sentiment and America's obsession with China, that gets extended to Japanese and Koreans too, as Professor Chang touched on. And then, okay, what else was there? And then Weiling Deng was speaking about the purpose of higher education. My daughter just graduated from UCLA last year with a degree in political science. Asian international students exist in like separate spaces. What my daughter said in academia at UCLA, students usually end up in more silos than they did when they were in high school. So you have Japanese American students who were from predominantly white neighborhoods, and they want to be a part of the Nikkei Club. You have Black students who grew up in maybe diverse neighborhood, but there wasn't a strong Black identity, or a white neighborhood, and they want to be part of the Black Student Union. And it just kind of repeats itself. And then you have the international students. I mean, my daughter speaks Korean pretty well, well enough to understand the entire movie Parasite without subtitles. But I mean, her life is so different growing up half Korean American in LA. What is she going to really have anything to say about with a Korean international student or a Chinese international student? It just really, we don't all know each other. We don't all know each other. So I think the way the bridging happens though is through community-based, service-based nonprofits like Asian Americans for Housing. I do have a coalition with several Asian American nonprofits and community-based organizations, including, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance. And I would talk left. I'm going to just close up by talking about, okay, so in 1992, what happened was it split the Korean American community in LA, right? Korean Americans who wanted to take the progressive assimilationist interethnic coalition building model and were, pro-democratic politics and progressive politics, largely stayed in LA. More conservative leaning or Republican Korean Americans, and that was a smaller group, moved to Orange County. So that split us politically, and this larger Korean American political identity was born. And a lot of the Korean American nonprofits like Koreatown Youth and Community Center in LA took a multi-ethnic approach. And then Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance was actually started by a group of Korean and Latinx workers in 1992. So since 1992, we have these, and Thai CDC is also does a lot of multi-ethnic work. So does a little Tokyo Services Center. So we've been doing this work for 30 years. Japanese Americans have been doing this work since the 40s. So there's always this new wave of Asian Americans that suddenly discovers racism. I can see that they discovered it last Wednesday. They discovered it 2 months ago. And there are always Asian Americans like myself. You know, we've been doing the work for decades and we're here. And I think it's really a matter of trying to do some research, trying to find each other. And, you know, 1992 is different from 2020. We have the internet now. Look at this discussion we're having. Thank you, and I'm done speaking.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really remarkable. And I hope that a lesson that everybody today comes away with is that, you know, that two things can be true at the same time, right? To quote Susan Park just now, right? That two things can be true in the sense that 19th century history can be really important and very recent history can be very important, right? That these big narratives like The Ghosts of Gold Mountain, like Dr. Chang's fantastic book, that they're really important to understanding what's going on yesterday, but that it's also really important to do these hyper-focused, localized, storytelling-based histories as well. And that when we can find ways to balance both, that, you know, I think that we can get the best answers to these big questions. Okay, so we have 25 minutes for questions for Q&A. And I thought we could start off, our society president actually has a really excellent question. And Jim, I'd love to invite you if you want to ask it yourself, or I could ask it for you. So either way. Okay.
Peter, please go ahead.
Okay. So Jim was wondering, and I think this is mostly a question for Dr. Chang, but I think that this also draws on knowledges about relational frameworks. Jim was wondering if there's an even deeper or older history that we could draw on for making sense of xenophobia and the construction of anti-Asian hatred that goes back to the Know Nothings, that goes back to the, let's say, the 1840s and anti-Irish discrimination. And so I think it's an excellent question that gets us thinking about how all things are connected. So Dr. Chang, would you please feel free to take that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, and it's very true because as we know from books, a recent book by Erica Lee on American xenophobia, that xenophobia is part and parcel of American history. And it's one of the, we can talk a lot about this, the United States is an inclusive society and state, but also exclusive. And the two are not exclusive. The two are intricately connected, that you can include some people, white, European immigrants, and exclude others. And people are included on certain bases and excluded on the same basis, but excluded. So the issue of xenophobia is a curious one in a country that prides itself as a land of immigrants, but it's also a land of xenophobia. So Jim is absolutely right to link it to that. So I don't challenge that in any way, but I think it's another context to keep in mind. Violence is certainly not unique to Asian Americans. In fact, we know is part and parcel. It's part of the fabric and warp of the country. The country is extraordinarily violent. I mean, both on a state level as well as on a social and an individual level. And I think about this a lot. Mm-hmm. A country that is so rich and developed in so many different ways and prides itself as this or that, and yet is so deeply barbaric. And how do we understand those? So these frames, they're main frames for every story. And we heard some really good other frames from the other speakers today. And I think that, as you said, you can have multiple truths. There are multiple frames that are useful. And I really appreciate that view, and also invite others in the Zoom to think about other frames. This is what we're presenting here is not exclusive.
Anybody else want to pick that up? And if not, that is absolutely fine. I will say too that I think we always have to remind ourselves that in settler colonialism, the way that settler colonialism works is through popular violence. It's through vigilantism, right? So the California Indian catastrophe, for instance, was not carried out by professionals, right? It was not carried out by a standing military in uniforms alone, at least. They participated, but they were not the only participants. It was also by gold miners. It was also by posses that would form sometimes spontaneously and sometimes hired as mercenaries by capitalists. So anyway, I think that goes along with what Dr. Chang is saying, that this is an extraordinarily violent country. And with that in mind, I would recommend another book, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is an activist and writes about indigenous histories in the United States, has a new book out called Not a Nation of Immigrants, directly in response to JFK's award-winning A Nation of Immigrants. She's saying it's not a nation of immigrants because there are all these indigenous people, they're not immigrants. And then there are these white settlers, and honestly, they're not really always immigrants either. Some are and some aren't. Okay, so the next question that I had, Susan, would you like to jump in?
Yes, because I wanted to address stop API hate, in the now, in the moment. I just want to present some comments and observations. So when you're reading or seeing media reports, just remember that the media is very sensationalistic. Leading up to 1992, the LA Times swore up and down that the only thing happening in the entire world was Black and Korean conflict, which is the term that the LA Times coined. Nothing else was happening, for a while. So we want to look at the violence against Asian Americans, not just as an emotion, but look at, the matrix of domination and oppression that people are living under, that Asian Americans and Black Americans and, other people of color are living in. We want to look at, we want to question these stories, right? It is not a simple matter of a random Black person pushing over an old Asian person. We want to ask questions like, why is this Asian American senior collecting cans? Why did their apartment in Chinatown become burned down and they had to move to Harlem? Did they get redress for their apartment that burned down? Was it some illegal housing? Why are they not getting social services? Why are they not getting mental health services in Chinese languages? Why are there civic institutions? Because those kinds of things add layers of cushion and safety. They're not, catch-alls, but those things add layers. And we are going to find some incidents, obviously, of anti-Asian hate being the motivating force, but we need to look at stories individually and also ask more questions about some of the perpetrators. A man who killed his own mother, his anti-Asian sentiment is the least of his evils, So we don't, Asian Americans, we don't like it when flat single stories about us are hyper-visibilized. Yeah. All groups of POC Americans don't like this. Black Americans don't like this. We need to show grace and fairness to each other and study the facts about other groups of Americans too. So that would be my main comment. And then Asian Americans for Housing has built LA County's largest inter-ethnic direct aid coalition. And I addressed diversity of diversity. I addressed diversity of diversity among Asian Americans. I emphasize diversity, that there's diversity of Chinese people. It's Chinese languages, Chinese peoples, Chinese countries. China is huge. The culture is huge. The sinosphere is huge. So there's so much diversity in group too. And then with my coalition building, it's not just one Native American group. I don't practice tokenism. It's several. It's as many as it's 3, 4, 5. Same thing with the Black American groups. There's a lot of economic diversity. I think when, I hear certain people, white people, Asians, we have to help Black people. It can be a little patronizing, the tones online, the tones on media. But, Black Americans also have a lot of deep political knowledge. I mean, they've been studying this. They've been the most subjected to this consistently and brutally so for over 400 years. And I want to make the point that when I started my nonprofit, it was 2 Black elected officials, Herb Wesson and Mark Whitley Thomas, who helped me with funding, getting started with funding. And it was, Black nonprofits and Black CBOs, community-based organizations, who did not deny that there are marginalized Asian Americans. Okay. Other groups of people did. And that includes white, Latinx, and indigenous. They just didn't know. Native Americans didn't. Because it's different. Because indigenous, I'm saying like Mesoamericans, they're new to the country too. But I did not get that pushback from Black Americans. So you also have to understand that white media quotes certain kinds of Black voices too and hyper visibilizes them. I read an article recently that said Ronald Eskew, AKA Najee Ali, a prominent activist in the Black community. And this was just a year ago. He's not self-described Black nationalist. He has openly spoken about how he targeted Koreans and scapegoated them, and he's happy he did that. He still talks about it. And he's also been discredited by the Black community.
Yes, he is.
So be careful what you read, and also always like give a little more grace to other people and investigate, and like don't take things at face value. Thank you, I'm done.
Oh, that's
Thank
so
you.
well said. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, thank you, Susan. I just wanted to comment really fast on your comment about perceived Black spokesman like Najee Ali, who is discredited and everything. And I think that's important for you to bring up. Not only has he directed hate towards the Korean American community, but Black women too. He's directed this hate and this violence and everything. And I just thank you, Susan, for bringing that up. We have just discussed this today. That's so important to recognize who is really for the community and who is there for their own ego and their own self-worth. So I so appreciate that, Susan. Thank you so much. Peter, back to you. Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a couple of other questions, but I want to make sure that I make time for anybody who wants to jump in at this point. So we've had some interesting comments in the chat. We have a lot of audience here. So if you have something, this is your moment.
I do want one other person to be known, and his name is Billion Godson. You
Yes,
can look at
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
LA. Okay.
Yes,
I adopted him because what he target Asian American businesses in South Central LA, usually Asian and sometimes Latinx, usually business owners who don't speak English that well. Everybody knows that Asian Americans and Latinx who don't speak English that well, we look like, we're going to be made to look like fools, right? He targets them when he needs jobs and free stuff for the things he does. And I've met him, he's fine with me. But what I did when I started my nonprofit, because he targets when he needs like things for his free store, he wants jobs for his children, all of a sudden he's making these trumped up charges. The Latinx are racist, that Korean liquor store owner is racist, the Cambodian fried chicken store owner is racist. And he's just trying to get jobs for his extended family members and some goods for his free store. So in March, through community liaisons, but I've met him directly, I've been fine talking to him directly too. I made an offer that he can take all the free produce boxes from me that he needs, okay, to give out to his free store. And he couldn't because his car was broken down, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but more importantly, he gets quoted by white media.
Yes, he does. Yes,
Korean American, she's not in South Central LA.
He's not.
And Dennis is like, yes, speak. So you should characters are legitimized by media when they're illegitimate in their own communities, and they actually hurt Black people more. Black women, they're anti-gay men, they're anti-trans women. To be honest, I mean, Asian Americans are pretty much on the bottom of their list to bother. But it happens, so you should be aware of these things.
Right.
Thank you, and I'm done.
No, that's so important, Susan. I have met Billion Godson at Cal State LA, same kind of hustle and everything. And we need our students to be aware of this, especially if we want our students to have critical thinking skills and look at things critically. I think it's really important. I was so distressed when I had heard about Najee Ali and what he did with Black women. I just, I don't want to work around that. I don't want my students involved in that movement if that's what we represent too. So Susan, I think this is a wealth of knowledge for the young people that are in our audience too, which are my students. So I just appreciate your honesty. Very authentic, so much. Peter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here, I'll just jump in with a question. And if anybody else wants to throw something out there, please put it in the chat. The question that I have is about the varieties of forms that violence can take. And I want to really highlight workplace violence. I think workplace violence is a theme that actually brings the work and the expertise of all three panelists together. What about the history of workplace violence can we use to make better sense of what happened in Atlanta in particular? I know it's a tough question, but I think it's
I don't want to too much, but 4 of the 6 Asian women who were killed were Korean Americans, and 2 were Chinese American. And since, you know, I am an East Asian person, it's something I looked at very, you know, carefully and with a lot of tears and mourning. You know, I think a lot of people, even like Asian Americans who think they're so like woke, they're folk, and they think they're like so elite. It wasn't just white media and white people. They did it too, but so did a subgroup of Asian Americans who think they're so like just woke, assumed that the women were sex workers. And they were posting things like, this is a good time to comment on, you know, sex trafficking. And they assumed that there was something illicit going on. You know, Asian massage parlors, sometimes, you know, they're just massage parlors. They're just regular massage parlors that like my parents go to. I go to with my mom. I go to with my daughter. They're just regular. They may look a little tacky in terms of like not having that hipster or, you know, bliss spa aesthetic, but they're just regular massage parlors a lot of times. There's no need to assume anything. And then the ages of the women began to be revealed. I mean, 70-something-year-old Korean American grandma, sex worker, go granny. But she wasn't. There are lots of other jobs in a massage parlor besides giving massages, and there are legitimate massages. You have to get a license, certified massage therapist to touch somebody's body, okay? And there are lots of being the receptionist, cleaning, you know, resetting a room, making sure everything's clean. There are lots of other jobs. The assumption that Aaron Long made in his story that he was a sex addict was that every kind of Asian parlor was a sex den that he could be tempted by, and that every woman who works at them, I mean, he couldn't tell that these women were in their 60s and 70s and 50s, you know? So again, what we see is it can be any kind of reason, but the constant theme is forever foreign, invisibilized, will project whatever we want onto an Asian. Thank you, I'm done.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on
Well,
that
it's an
question?
interesting observation. I've been, you know, I haven't had that question before, Peter. So it's an interesting one. You know, I would take it a different way, and that is to say, most of us are working people, of some form. I mean, intellectual workers, whatever you want to categorize them. A few of us are capitalists. Some of us are storekeepers, but you know, they work long and hard too. So. You know, this is not a proto-Marxist argument, but most of us are working people, and therefore our identities and our context, our situations, are largely defined by how we sustain ourselves. So, even if I talk about Vincent Chin, his murder was not at a workplace, but it was at a working class bar. He was sort of a working guy. The 2 guys are unemployed auto workers. That's how they're usually characterized. So this is a condition of our existence that we're identified largely by the position we have as working people. And now, when you talk about Asian Americans, you know, up until recently, this is one of the unusual features of the Asian American population today, is I've always sort of tried to characterize it or portray it, visualize it, is a sort of a dumbbell. you have one end, which are professionals, and then you have the other end, which a large number of very low-paid people, and it's not a pyramid, as some people think of any social structure. It's more of a dumbbell, and so in both, but just the way I did it is Asian American population is characterized socioeconomically. So now, what is the relationship to violence? It appears that many of the people who have been attacked have not been professionals. So, have been people who were on the streets and in subways and all this. Now, I just would, maybe I'm just contradicting myself or blabbing on here, but it is not relegated just to one socioeconomic end. But the issue with racial violence is it affects anybody who looks like a possible target. So I've been talking to people who are wealthy, Asian Americans, professors who were at Williams, professors who were at Princeton, professors who are at Stanford, Asian Americans, and they've all told me they're afraid to walk out in the street. They're afraid to get in the subway in New York because they don't want to get pushed under the tracks. I haven't met anybody, any Asian American, relatives, my friends, colleagues who are Asian Americans, who's not expressed anxiety. I mean, this is not just a few score, a few hundred, a few thousand incidents. It is virtually an entire Asian American population in some form has been shaken because it has been so brutal and random and clearly racialized. So if this, I see this as some ways a turning point. There are many different turning points. 1992, Vincent Chin this is a turning point in that it's been so ubiquitous across the country in different communities, different Asian ethnicities, and it has been so graphically captured and tragic because of the victims are so vulnerable. So these features, if we can talk about specificity, we need to talk about specificity in this context. I've been trying to think about how to explain these patterns, and gender is very much part of it. Now here I'm going to blather on. Well, no, I'll just stop there, and maybe Weiling should jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking that Kathy Park Han has she published an article on The Atlantic right after the Atlanta shooting, and the title I remember was "This Time It Feels Different." It does, very different from before, and for the younger generation, for the newer immigrants from China or the rest of Asia, this tragedy really blows off some of the illusions of innocence. As long as we stick with, so the illusion goes like, as long as we stick with the mainstream, as long as we follow the framework of becoming a enterprising subject, a good global citizen, we're gonna somewhat be sheltered from all these workplace violence, variety of violences that can happen outside of the institutional protection of the students or scholars or professionals from a more well-off family background. So one thing I would add to this conversation is that education should really address or should really problematize the sense of innocence that students have. I mean, we can't just look forward or upward to becoming more like an elite or anything, but it's in the sides of, in the sideways or in the margins where more realities of violence will be revealed. So yeah, so innocence is something that cuts connections between a group of at least temporarily more protected people from the rest of the population. So the innocence applies to both international students from Asia and elsewhere, but also to white students. So one thing that teaching white students that's really challenging is they can't really connect the agitated emotions, especially fears directed to China, and the kind of anti-Asian hate in America. So there's a lot of connections between these two sites of violence. So the kind of job that education, and especially internationally oriented education, should really take on as its mission is to build this relational perspective that fears of one country or one race can really quickly and profoundly translate it into hate that's directed to people who look like Asians in America.
Well said. Thank you. Okay, so this is our 2-minute warning. So I feel like we should probably start wrapping up. But that being said, I've got one last-minute question from Dr. Donna Shealy, also a board member at the Society and former president, who pointed out that we should definitely be thinking about where the model minority trope or myth stands in the age of COVID, which I think is a really good question, and maybe something for people to think about and see if they can come up with their own answer to as our event comes to a close. I'd also like to just thank everybody for being here. I mean, I thought this was incredibly illuminating. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody who's here has benefited similarly. And just as a final comment, we have another event. This is a series, as Dr. Dennis pointed out at the very beginning, a History Makers series from the Historical Society of Southern California. I want to thank everyone who was involved with making this happen. President Trinquada suggested this in the first place. Executive Director Lauren Levy handled tech. There was a lot of work that went into organizing, and I was proud to participate in that. And thank you to my co-organizers. And the event we're organizing next is going to be a celebration of a book called To Live and Defy in LA, How Gangster Rap Changed America by Dr. Felicia Viator of San Francisco State. And she'll be joining us in a month, May 27th. And she'll be with her mentor from UC Berkeley, Dr. Martin, who's written this incredible book about the Black Panthers, Dr. Eric Avila, who's my mentor, my advisor at UCLA, and Dr. Daniel Widener. So anyway, I want to promote that briefly to everybody here. Please feel free to follow up, and we can give you a link for that. And once again, thank you so much to our teachers who've come to tell us about what they've told us today and to help us to better understand this moment. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for attending our inaugural session for our History Makers. I want to encourage you that, to support the Historical Society. I put the link in the chat. It's the hssc.org. We would love to have you join our society because we want to continue with these programming, and we can't do that unless we have a robust membership. So please, check out the website and sign up for the next webinar, as Peter had said, and then join our society. We would love to see and work with you and collaborate with you. So with that, I bid everybody good night. Thank you so much for attending. We appreciate you, Dr. Chang. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Dr.